Hello, my name is Kevin McCormick, and I am doing this video here to put a slide presentation up on the subject of the NEED Act, the National Emergency Employment Defense Act, National Emergency Employment Defense Act. And I learned about this as a member of a group in the Green Party called the Greens for Monetary Reform. And they have a website, greensformonetaryreform.org. And so I'm going to, let's see here, start the slideshow talking about the NEED Act. And we do this, I'm using the Zoom service, and I'm going to share my screen here and talk about this. There we go. Okay. Monetary reform. Public money is essential for democracy and for a just and sustainable economy. A discussion of the NEED Act. And our URL is there, greensformonetaryreform.org. Okay, so the NEED Act, monetary reform, replace private money with public money because we need to do this. The United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power, and among the powers there is the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Now I make a note here, but the ability to create money has been contested throughout the history of the United States, with private financial interests seeking to control this government power for their own benefit through establishing a central bank. Money creation is a government power. Now, I put this in here. This is from the case of the mixed monies, and this was a case in England back in 1604. The Queen had issued a special money for Ireland. England, of course, had conquered Ireland and was abusing the people there. But they didn't have enough money, so the Queen issued this special money just for Ireland, and then this person wanted to pay their debt with that money. So the payment was upheld in the court, and the court says, it appertaineth only to the King of England to make or coin money within his dominion, so that no other person can do it without special license or commandment of the king. And if any person chose to do it of his own head, it is treason against the person of the king by the common law. So this is to show that there is a long legal tradition, and our United States legal tradition does come from England, the common law. And so it's been a long established principle. Of course, this, as with everything in the subject of money, is disputed, but it is there. Okay, so some banking history. The Federal Reserve can be traced back to the Bank of England, which was founded in 1694. Now, the English king, William III, needed to raise large sums to rebuild the navy. And so this caused him to have to borrow the money. Now, after the quote that we have from our case, why would the King of England need to borrow money? Well, Walter Bagehot, an author back in the 19th century, gives a history of a fractured system of commerce and sovereign malfeasance in his book called In Lombard Street, which explains why the king lacked the practical ability to issue the needed money. So basically, in that time, there were a lot of small municipalities, little kingdoms, fiefdoms, and the system was very fractured, very localized, and all of these little minor nobility and the leaders of those areas issued their own coins. But none of them had the territory or the commercial economy, the whatever that would keep things contained within their territory. So everything was kind of intermingled, and you had coins from everywhere. So a sovereign authority really couldn't have a money system because they just weren't big enough, they just weren't powerful enough, and they just didn't have enough commerce under their legal system. So, and England had the royalty manage things differently. Maybe they could have, but they were involved in some kind of tremendous scandal, the king before William, and there was an English Revolution. There was just a lot of political upheaval at the time. But the money was raised through a subscription, and the Bank of England was formed as a result. And this bank was given limited liability, and it was allowed to issue banknotes. So the limited liability corporation and issuing banknotes, those are the essential elements of the Federal Reserve monetary system that we live under today. Corporate power and bank created money. Okay, so the United States has a history of central banks. The first Bank of the United States lasted for 20 years. It was controversial. Many Americans at that time were against it because they remembered the financial oppression from the Bank of England, which they said was the main cause of the American Revolution. There was foreign ownership of the Bank of the United States, and it was in competition with state-chartered banks, and it was involved in some political intrigue. So its charter was not renewed. The second Bank of the United States was formed shortly thereafter. It was aligned with the Whig Party. Andrew Jackson became president. He was a Democrat. He denounced the bank as an engine of corruption, and he succeeded in preventing its charter from being renewed. So after that, there was the era of free banking, the national bank system. The history's quite involved. The story of the free banking era was that banks would be formed. They lasted a few years. So they were very insecure. It was a constant problem of the bank issuing notes and then closing down. Bank notes were discounted. You know, your bank note was worth maybe half its face value at a competing bank or something like that. And there were constant inflations and depressions going on all through that time period. So the Federal Reserve system was created in 1913, and part of it was to alleviate the financial ups and downs from the private banking system. Well, what happened, of course, was the Federal Reserve immediately started inflating the money. The inflation led to the stock market bubble of the 1920s, which then crashed. And then we had the Great Depression. And this led to World War II. Now, you know, this whole thing of banks and wars, corporations, inflations, deflations, this is just, if you read the history of the Federal Reserve and of central banks and banking cartels, it just goes around and around, but it's always the same kind of thing. War, corporations, inflation, deflation. Okay, so anyway, World War II created so much debt that it reliquefied the Federal Reserve System, and then Keynesian economics was adopted in the United States, and it has maintained the monetary inflation necessary for the Federal Reserve System to function. Okay, so in the 1930s, a plan was put together by some economists. Mr. Fisher is a name that comes to mind. And they published, well, they didn't actually publish. They wrote a little paper which was not published, but then it was found. And I don't have the link to it exactly, but I think you can find it by looking for the Chicago Plan on Wikipedia. Throughout our history, no economic problem has been more passionately discussed than the money problem. Probably none has had the distinction of suffering so much from general misunderstanding. And I recall a quote from Samuel Adams where there's a whole page of quotations from Samuel Adams. And back in the early days of the United States. And one of the things he said was that there was a lot of problems from not understanding coin and credit. And people don't understand it, but it was highly debated earlier on. In my generation, it has not really been debated much because the corporations control the media and they do not want to talk about their money system. But the Chicago Plan economists make the statement that practically every period of economic hope and promise has been a mere inflationary boom characterized by an expansion of the means of payment and has been followed by a depression characterized by a detrimental contraction of the means of payment. So in other words, we have a boom when the banks inflate the money supply, and then we have a bust when the banks contract the money supply. The Chicago Plan, a little bit more on it. The economists who proposed the Chicago Plan wanted a 100% reserve banking system. Now, this was put together, these ideas were put together in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. So they talk about fractional reserve lending. And the way that fractional reserve lending was taught, I don't know if it's even discussed anymore, but it was taught in school at one time, where a bank would have a deposit and they would have to keep a fraction of that deposit on hand, and they could lend out the remaining fraction. But this is a misstatement. Fractional reserve lending is propaganda. It's a propaganda term to cover the concept of bank creation of money. The deposits in banks are actually created by loan proceeds being deposited. Basically what happens, the bank funds a loan by creating money for that loan, and then if you're borrowing money, say to buy a car, well, the bank creates the money and credits it to your account, then you make your payment, and that payment becomes a deposit when in the account of the person you're buying the car from. So basically, there's no real limitation on bank money creation. They just have to be able to get people to borrow money. So the banks thus exercise what has always been considered a prerogative of sovereign power. Okay, now the NEED Act. H.R. 2990 was introduced in Congress by Dennis Kucinich in 2011. Dennis Kucinich was a member of Congress from Ohio. He since was gerrymandered out of his seat, and he was a Democrat, and it's very possible that it was because he proposed the NEED Act. The NEED Act is a plan for creating and managing a monetary system in which the U.S. money supply is created by Congress, and banks are prohibited from creating money. I want to mention Stephen Zarlinga. He is the author of a book called The Lost Science of Money. The Lost Science of Money. And he says about the NEED Act, the remedy proposed contains all of the essential monetary measures being proposed by the American Monetary Institute. These are what decades of research and centuries of experience have shown to be necessary to end the economic crisis in a just and sustainable way and place the U.S. money system under our constitutional checks and balances. And yes, it can be done. The book that Stephen Zarlinga wrote is called The Lost Science of Money, as I'm now saying for the third time. I read the book. It's long, but it's interesting. It goes through the history of money systems in Western civilization. And he makes a couple notes. One that references to how money systems worked in the ancient past are oftentimes missing from the historical record. And this is not really a surprise, because all through the history of money systems, there has been tremendous competition and battle over who has the right and power to create and issue money. Because if you think about it, being able to create and issue money would be the path to great wealth and power. So it's a contested matter, and it has been throughout Western history. Okay, the key parts of the NEAT Act. So now I'm just going to get into talking about the NEAT Act. I want people to know what it's about. And so this talk is really going through the basics of the NEAT Act and at least my interpretation of it. I think it's pretty close to accurate. Excuse me. Payment of the federal debt, the monetary authority, the Bureau of the Federal Reserve, transition to United States money, the revolving fund, and then there are some additional provisions. Okay, so payment of the federal debt. In Section 106, the NEAT Act says origination in lieu of borrowing. So the Treasury will create money for government expenditures if available funds are not sufficient. So if the tax revenues are not enough, the Treasury would create the money for the expenditures. Borrowing is prohibited. So what this means is that the federal debt will stop growing. The federal government would stop borrowing money. Whether there's enough funds available is a matter of tax policy. Is the government collecting enough revenue to cover its budget? Okay, Section 107, retirement of instruments of indebtedness. The Treasury will retire federal debt obligations as they become due and payable. So, for example, if you bought a 10-year federal bond, then you would collect interest on that bond for 10 years, and then after the 10-year period, the bond would be paid for by the government with United States money. And then you would have to do something with that money, invest it in some way. Okay. So the monetary authority. The NEAT Act creates a monetary authority. And the monetary authority will be an independent body within the U.S. Treasury Department and will determine the amounts of money to be originated and most efficient method of disbursement. And the primary duty of the monetary authority is to establish monetary supply policy and monitor the nation's monetary status. So this, the monetary supply policy, this is about how much money is created, how much money is there in the money supply. Monitoring this and maintaining it is a constant process, constant adjustments. And, you know, so is it being distributed correctly? Are the government programs that are funded working right? And what's the situation with the banking and credit system and all that? So the monetary authority would be maintaining the money supply and monitoring the status. Okay, so more about the monetary authority, accounting and forecasting. So the monetary authority would continuously and effectively assess and report on all aspects of disbursements, on the economy and money supply. Okay, so basically a lot of data collection, a lot of reports, and this is very important. It's a public money system and the public needs to know what's going on. So the monetary authority should be creating and issuing reports on a constant basis. Okay, and then under Section 305 of the NEAT Act, the monetary authority could be the lender of last resort. And a lender of last resort if 2/3 of Congress and the President declare a national emergency. So in other words, if there was such a thing as a depression under the NEAT Act, the monetary authority could step in and be the lender of last resort. The Bureau of the Federal Reserve. Okay, so the Federal Reserve, instead of being the face of the banking cartel and the Open Market Committee and the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve becomes a bureau as part of the Treasury Department and under the authority of the Treasury Department and the Monetary Authority. So it basically would administer the payment system, the banking system, keeping track of the statistics and the data, reconciling checks. These are all things that the Federal Reserve does now. The the mechanics of maintaining the payment system and um, making sure that money is available, that the currency is being printed and being managed. That's what happens now. Dollars are printed and then old dollars are destroyed. The paper only lasts for so long. Okay, so that's a continuation of that aspect of the money system that we have now. There's the transition to U.S. money, replacing fractional reserve banking with the lending of United States money. So basically, instead of Federal Reserve notes, we would have United States notes. They would look the same, probably be in the same denominations, but instead of saying Federal Reserve note, it would say United States note. Now, in this, you have your bank accounts, okay? So most money in the money system is actually in bank accounts rather than in currency. And we have what's called a transaction account. And now these are known today as checking or savings accounts, draft accounts, what have you. They're basically demand accounts. And what this means is that you put a deposit in the bank and you can take it out whenever you want. You write a check, what have you. Your money is available on demand. These funds would be held by banks as a bailment. And this is a very important point because under the current Federal Reserve System, when you put money in the bank, that money belongs to the bank. It's their money and they can spend whatever they want. They just owe it back to you. So it's a debtor-creditor relationship. But under the NEAT Act, it would become a bailment or a trust relationship. So the banks would not be allowed to spend money that you put in. They're just keeping it. Okay, so you have deposit insurance on these transaction accounts, and they do not pay interest, and there could be a fee for having the account. And so that's pretty much the way it is now. The transaction account, the main difference with the NEAT Act is that it is now a bailment arrangement rather than a debtor-creditor relationship. Banks would also be allowed to sell certificates of deposit, and they could sell securities, meaning bonds or stocks or whatever, to get more capital so that they could lend that. An investment deposit is an account that where you deposit money in the bank for a specific time. That's a certificate of deposit. That becomes property of the bank. Interest is paid, but there is no deposit insurance. Okay, then we come to the revolving fund. The NEAT Act under Section 403, establishment of Federal Revolving Fund. This is a special fund for the banking and credit system, and it's called the revolving fund. So what happens is banks could borrow money from the revolving fund for loans they make to customers. Then, as the loans are repaid, the banks return the principal to the revolving fund and keep the interest as their income. So the banks do not create money when they fund loans. They borrow the money from the revolving fund. It already exists, but this is kind of a privileged situation for the banks in a way. But there's also an important discipline that you have here, and that is having to pay back the revolving fund. Right now, with bank creation of money, they can simply create more money. If they have a problem, they make an imprudent loan, or they're getting into what's known as moral hazard or malinvestment, they can simply create more money to cover it up. And a good example is in my opinion at least, is the pipeline that was put where we had the big water protector scandal. And the protests there, the fracking industry has never made a profit and continues to have more and more debt. And then the banks created the money to fund this pipeline for the purpose of trying to save the fracking industry or to keep it afloat a little while longer. So stuff like that wouldn't necessarily happen with the NEAT Act because I mean, it's not that the pipeline would not have happened. It might have still happened if investors wanted to make speculative investments in it. But the banks would not have been able to fund it because they have to pay back the revolving fund. So if they're going to loan money into some kind of business venture that's probably not going to pay, that's probably not going to pay the loans back, then they would get stuck when they're not being able to pay back the revolving fund. So this is an important discipline that we do not have with the Federal Reserve System. More on the revolving fund. The Bureau of the Federal Reserve would administer it, and this is a lot of accounting process once again. And the fractional reserve lending, of course, is stopped, is prohibited. Bank creation of money is expressly prohibited under the Need Act. So the total amount of bank credit would be limited by the balance of the revolving fund and by loans made from the bank's own capital. So again, that's introducing some discipline into the banking system that we do not have today. Additional parts of the Need Act. Okay, in Section 501, the Need Act advises Congress that direct funding of infrastructure improvements is possible. Section 502 is an important part of the Need Act. It introduces interest rate ceilings. Now, this addresses the problem of usury, U-S-U-R-Y, usury. And usury is abusing people through money. And we think of it in our modern times in terms of excessive interest rates. So we have a lot of credit cards, payday lending, really abusive lending where the interest rates are very high, 25, 35%. And then on top of that, they have penalties and fees and whatnot. So the interest rate's annual percentage would be limited to 8%, and that's inclusive of all charges. So in other words, interest is anything above and beyond the original principal of the loan. And then the amount of interest cannot exceed the amount borrowed. So you can get into a situation with credit cards and some credit arrangements where you're paying back 2 or 3 times more than you borrowed. So, but an exception is made for mortgage loans because a 30-year mortgage loan, very often the interest will be more than the principal. But if you ever look at a mortgage schedule, amortization schedule as they call it, this is where the principal is slowly paid down over the course of 10, 20, 30 years. You'll see that the total interest, the longer the loan is, the more the interest is. And when you get into 30-year loans, you can be paying 2 or 3 times more for your house than the mortgage amount. Okay. Section 503 talks about the authority of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and it continues. And again, the FDIC will be in a much better position with the Need Act and transaction accounts being held in a bailment situation. You know, right now, if a major bank were to fail and be unable to pay back the depositors, the FDIC would be liable for huge amounts of money on the insurance. And if you look into it, you'll see the FDIC doesn't have anywhere near the amount of money it would need. But if the money, the checking accounts and savings accounts are held in a bailment situation and the bank does not spend that money, then the FDIC outlay would be pretty small. And if the money was spent, why, it would be much more of a liability situation because in today's situation, the bank can just say that they weren't able to pay it back. It's a debt that they couldn't pay back, whereas under the Need Act, it would be a breach of fiduciary duty. Okay. Section 504, monetary grants to states. So if the monetary authority creates money, then 25% of that money would be distributed to the states in the next year. So if the federal government wants to create money, it has to share it with the states. Okay, Section 505 Education funding program. Again, the NEAT Act says that Congress would have the ability to fund education. And we know that Congress does have that ability, but it's not a requirement under the NEAT Act. It just becomes a possibility. Section 506, Social Security Trust Funds. The Social Security funding is strengthened. Section 507, Initial Monetary Dividend to Citizens. This is a possibility that extra money in the Federal Reserve System, which I understand in the accounting of the Federal Reserve System, there is a substantial amount of money that is not in the economy, and it would not be needed under the NEAT Act system. So it could be made a tax-free grant to citizens, basically allowing people to pay off a lot of debt and get themselves in much better financial shape. But again, this is a possibility, not a certainty under the NEAT Act. Okay, Section 508, universal health care funding. It would be possible for Congress to fund a Medicare for All program. Section 509, resolving the mortgage crisis. Now, the NEAT Act was proposed in 2011, and the mortgage crisis was fresh in everyone's mind. It has, time has elapsed, and it's becoming more of a distant crisis, but there are still Americans who have suffered from it. Section 510, interest-free lending to local government bodies. Congress could provide interest-free loans to local governments. This is very interesting because if you are in under a local government that has municipal bonds, for example, or state bonds, it's not uncommon for those type of bonds to end up costing twice as much as the bond amount by the time they're paid. Municipal bonds can be even worse, even worse than credit cards. So Congress could make interest-free loans for that. Okay, so the three essentials of monetary reform are nationalizing the Federal Reserve System, end of bank, which is actually private creation of money, and Congress, the federal government, creating and issuing the money into the economy. The money system will serve the public only when the public controls the money system. Okay, so this is something, if you think about it, if you were to have a magic checkbook and you could write as many checks as you wanted for any amount and they would never bounce, the likelihood is that you would use that for your own agenda. And that is exactly what happens with the banking cartel and the Federal Reserve monetary system. That's why we have an aristocracy of corporate oligarchs. The power of the corporations is really based on the banking cartel having the money creation. So this slide here is a diagram of how I think the NEAT Act monetary system would look. The basics, you have the Treasury and Monetary Authority up there in the upper left, the arrow going to the right to the revolving fund, and then the arrow from the revolving fund back and forth into the national economy. This is where the banks are making loans and then paying back the revolving fund with the principal as the customers pay their loans back. There's taxes, where taxes are taken out of the economy, returned to the monetary authority, and put back into the system for federal spending or the revolving fund. And then on the left, you have inputs from the federal government, congressional appropriations, that's spending bills, Social Security, grants and loans to states, and retiring the federal debt. Now, I did not, the NEAT Act does not address Social Security, but I put it in here because it's very important in the economy. In my opinion, Social Security is the foundation of the middle class in the United States, and it's a very important and major aspect of federal spending. So I think it goes there. Now, congressional appropriations, I want to also address this concept of a private economy and the federal government and all that, because we have a lot of propaganda that's anti-government. And this is, of course, it's in the corporate media, which is basically the only media that we have in the United States. And it's constantly running down the government and saying the government is bad and private enterprise is good. But if you look at the facts, you see that I already mentioned Social Security. You have the healthcare system. That is like 14, 15% of the economy. It is totally dependent on Medicare. Um, they have outrageous prices, and we pay a lot for outrageous insurance. This is inflation of healthcare costs, and it is outrageous. And of course, it's not really reported in the media. But it's important to keep in mind that the whole foundation of the healthcare cartels and the healthcare situation is that the federal government pays with Medicare and also a lot of subsidies for drugs and pharmaceuticals. And then you have the defense industry. And this is a huge congressional appropriation, and it is really absolutely important in the economy. Not saying that the defense industry is good. I mean, we could be spending that money on renewable energy. We could be spending that money on infrastructure. We could spend that money on education. We could spend that money on a lot of things that do much more good for the public than blowing up missiles in the Middle East. But I just want to address the myth of this so-called private economy and private. It's just, if you look at it. Oh, one more thing I wanted to say was the interest on the federal debt, which is also becoming a huge amount of federal spending. So when you get down to it, the key features of the economy are the spending. The money really comes from the federal government. And it's how it's distributed. Is it going to be through corporate subsidies and interest payments to wealthy bondholders and to the bank and to the financial sector? Is it going to be through payment of exorbitant fees and costs into the healthcare cartels? Or is it going to be for the public good? So that is an important point, and that is my version of the very basic, bare bones outline of how the NEAT Act monetary system would look in the economy. Okay, so to kind of wrap this up, for those of you who are interested in this subject, which I hope, hopefully if you're watching, you are, to understand what this is about, I think you need to answer 4 questions. What is money? That's the first question. The second is, where does money come from? The third question, what is wealth? And the fourth question, where does wealth come from? Now, I have some suggested answers here, but these questions might seem very simple, but it's a challenge to answer them. We are just constantly given all kinds of information about money, but not about what it is. How to save money, what's responsible with money, and you constantly trying to figure out how you're going to pay your bills, how can you get more money, things like that. But what is money? So the answer that I have is that it is a creation of the human mind. Money exists not by nature, but by law. Now that quote, the last one, money exists not by nature, but by law, is from Aristotle back in the time of ancient Greece. So, and this has been, and it's in Stephen Zarlenga's book, The Lost Science of Money, that you go back and forth between systems where you have public money and a very healthy, successful society. Then the government is taken over by wealthy and plutocrats, and money becomes something that is controlled for their interests. Money systems are destroyed, they are undermined, they're sabotaged. It's There's actually a lot to it, and most people don't know the first thing about it. So it's something to educate yourself on. Where does money come from? Well, I say here the answer is money is created by a sovereign authority marking and issuing a token. So the example here is if you have two silver coins. One silver coin might be issued by the Sunshine Mint, a silver company, or a silver or a minting company. You know, there's these companies that do that. And another coin, which is exactly the same content, exactly the same size and weight. It's stamped U.S. dollar from the United States Mint. Well, that is money, whereas the other coin is a medallion, and it's not money. So it's the mark of the authority that makes a token into money. And then what is wealth? Okay, well, wealth is the abundance of valuable resources or valuable material possessions. And where does wealth come from? Wealth comes from society and organized human activity that creates an abundance of these possessions and resources. And it's to the benefit of the common good. And but you know, again, you go into a situation where all of that is appropriated by an aristocratic elite. And so you can see this happening reading history. But we don't get very much of that in the United States because our information is filtered through the corporate media, which does not want to talk about these four questions. So you're answering the questions, you're kind of on your own. And I think you're going to have to do some digging, and it takes a while for this to make sense. It takes a while to figure it out. It takes a while to see what it means. Okay, well, that is the end of the slideshow. I'm going to switch back here to the videos and sign out. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate that. I hope that you learned about the NEAT Act, and I hope that you are interested. Again, you can find the actual text to the NEAT Act at monetary.org, or we have it at the greensformonetaryreform.org website. And this is an important issue. You know, I did not even mention climate change, and here I am in the Green Party. You know, this is one of the main reasons that I am very strongly in favor of the NEAT Act. And the Federal Reserve System requires constant inflation, constant growth, infinite growth on a finite planet. One of the main reasons that we are having so much trouble adapting to climate change and dealing with climate change is because of the Federal Reserve monetary system and the need to maintain fossil fuels and the consumption economy, because the Federal Reserve monetary system depends on everybody being in debt and always needing money. And this is the fossil fuel system driving your car. If you think about it, you have to be buying gas all the time. If we could get the NEAT Act passed and get into a sovereign monetary system, we would have the flexibility to make the adaptations and the changes that we need to make to transition into something that is sustainable. So again, you know, is the money system going to serve society, or is society going to serve the money system? So with that thought, I want to thank you again for watching, and I wish you good luck.